Welcome back to the Perlworks channel. My name is John. Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. Stick around to the end to see how you can make your next move with Squarespace. Let's get to the build. So my wife and I are having a baby in a couple of months, and I thought it would be cool if I built her a bassinet. And by her I mean the baby, not my wife. I used this piece of 8/4 white oak to build the bassinet, and it was about 12 inches wide, which ended up being almost perfect for the yield I needed for all the square stock. I got these pieces rough cut at the bandsaw. I usually do this at the table saw, but this piece was pretty heavy and had a nice cup to it, so I didn't want to get any of that tension on the blade. I then took the pieces over to the joiner and planer to get them milled up. Outside of the rockers, all of these pieces need to be 1 3/4 inches square, and so that's what I'm doing here at the joiner and planer and then eventually the table saw. After I get everything milled down to 1 3/4 inches, I kind of realized that that looked a little too heavy, so I went back to the planer and got everything milled down to 1 5/8 inches. I used the table saw and the crosscut sled to get everything cut to its final dimensions. After that, it took some time to get the pieces oriented properly and label them. There's a lot of pieces that look the same, so it's really important to make sure all the pieces are labeled so you know which corner they go to. Like most of my projects, I'm using dowels for the joinery. Drilling the holes into the end grain pieces is pretty straightforward. You just have to make sure you reference off the correct edge and drill your holes. For the vertical supports, you'll see that I had to have a couple of spacers to make sure that the pairs of holes were spaced out properly. If this wasn't the case, then the pieces might not go together correctly. Here's one of the vertical pieces. I'll start off with my jig referencing off what will be the top edge of the bassinet. I'll drill those 2 holes and then install my first spacer. This first spacer determines the length of spindle I'll need between the top and middle rails. I'll drill these 2 holes and then install my second spacer. The second spacer determines the space between the middle rail and the bottom support rail. One of the more crucial aspects to designing something for a child is spindle spacing. I'm going with a spacing of 2 1/8 inches, but you should check your local laws just to be sure. Then I'll head over to the drill press and get these holes drilled. I'm going to be using 1/2 inch walnut dowels and a 1/2 inch brad point bit. After drilling the holes, I could rip the tape off, which was really satisfying. Before gluing everything up, I gave most of the edges 3/8 inch radius roundovers, especially these edges where the spindles will go because the router will not be able to reach those later on. I did the glue up in 2 stages. The first stage was getting the 2 short side assemblies glued up, and then the second stage was getting everything else glued up together. I did do multiple dry fits just to make sure everything went together nicely and to make sure that all of my labeling was correct. Getting these spindles installed is not too difficult. I just used normal wood glue for this, and then next stage I'll use a different glue because I needed a little bit more open time. Here you can see why the dowel spacing was so critical. You can see the top, middle, and bottom support rails on the short side assemblies. The long side assemblies don't have the bottom rails because the rockers will essentially act as a support rail. When gluing up these longer pieces, I ended up using a liquid hide glue by Type Bond because it has a little bit longer open time than what I usually use. I knew that this was going to be a little bit of a hectic glue up because there's extra spindles to get lined up, and I had to get all of these pieces clamped up properly. I used 4 of these F-style clamps to get everything clamped down. I ended up taking these off and switching them out for pipe clamps because I needed a little bit extra clamping pressure. I used my CNC router to cut out a template of the rocker. I used 3/4 inch MDF and had to cut this out in 2 pieces similar to my squiggle template. But unlike the squiggle template, I added some notches to each end, and this way there were some registration points for the glue up, and this made sure that the pieces were aligned properly. I'm gluing on these auxiliary blocks because I didn't want to use a 5 or 6 inch wide piece. Instead, I'm using a 3.5 inch wide piece with these auxiliary blocks, and it just saves a little bit of wood. I drilled some holes in the bottom of the vertical pieces, and then I used some dowel centers to transfer those holes to the rocker pieces. If I had to do this again, I would probably lay the bassinet on its side so that the rocker and bassinet were both referencing off the same flat surface. I had some slight overlaps of about a 1/16 of an inch, which wasn't too difficult to blend with the sander, but nonetheless there's a better way to do it. I marked some lines on the rocker, referencing off the inside of the vertical pieces. Then I could lay down my template and trace it out, before heading to the bandsaw to get it rough cut. I had to attack this with 2 different bits, making sure that I was going downhill and with the grain, so as to avoid chip out. With certain woods, like in my Maloof table using sapele, I could get away with going against the grain with the same router bit, but this white oak was not going to be the same case. It was just way too much chip out and it was way too splintery. The first bit had a bearing on the bottom, and I was going downhill with that. And then I switched to this bit with the bearing on the top, and I had to take this in multiple passes because it was a shorter bit. I had to remove the template and lower the bit, and I eventually got it done in 3 passes. After getting the rockers trimmed up, I decided to test them out. And you can see that they rock nicely, and I am really excited. I stayed away from the tight curves with the flush trim bit because I was kind of scared that they would get some crazy chip out and ruin the rocker. So I went to the spindle sander to get them sanded down to my line. When I cut out the rockers on the bandsaw, I saved those offcuts, and then they came in handy for this glue up so that I could have a nice square clamping surface. The following is a really good example of what it's like to be me. I added a 3/8 inch radius roundover to all of the edges that the router could reach. For the edges that the router couldn't reach, I had to resort to, hand tools. The finish I'm using is a walnut oil by Mahoney's. They're not a sponsor, but they were kind enough to send me some of their product. I applied this in the same way that I apply Danish oil, which is a pretty heavy coat, and then letting it sit for a few minutes, and then coming back with some fresh towels to dry the piece off completely. I applied 2 coats and did sand with some 320 paper in between coats. The final step was to add the mattress supports. I added some pine brackets underneath these supports and then just screwed them down with a single screw on each side. Hey guys, thanks for checking this one out. I'm really excited with how this turned out. It's probably my favorite project to date just because of the meaning behind it, and I am a fan of the design as well. I tried to make it as traditional and classic as I could just so that it sort of stood the test of time design-wise. Hopefully this is used many times in the future. I guess we'll see. I'm really a fan of how well it rocks. It's got these little overlapping rockers. You could use your foot to rock it, or you could just use your hand to rock it. So if you guys do have any questions about the project, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them. I want to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform that lets you build beautiful websites using award-winning designer templates. One of my favorite features is how simple it is to create and maintain an online store. The shopping cart and payment methods are all built into the platform, which makes things super easy to modify. If you do run into any issues, Squarespace offers an award-winning 24/7 support team that has your back. And if you go to squarespace.com/PrillaWorks, you can start a free trial and save 10% on your first purchase. Thanks, Squarespace. And here are some final photos of the Bassinet. Thanks for watching.